Joining us now to discuss China trade and Washington's response, Judd Gregg, former Republican senator, former New Hampshire governor, Heidi Heitkamp, a former Democratic senator and CNBC contributor. More importantly, I know she throws that around even more than the Senate thing. Senator, good to see you both. Hey, Judd, you've written recently about, we know what the Democratic Party stands for, but you're wondering, what does the current Republican Party stand for in terms of, the deficits are pretty large. There's tariffs, there's protectionism, there's a trade war. In your view, with what's happening in Hong Kong right now, what would a classic Republican president do in terms of whether you try to help the protesters, try to calm the situation, try to give support to President Xi, not give support to President Xi? How should we be behaving there, and how's President Trump doing?
Well, I have to admit, Joe, I'm not an expert on Hong Kong, but I think the classic Republican response should be, we're for people who want to pursue liberty and people who want to pursue freedom and have the right to speak and do what they believe is correct in their government. And if they're shut down by an autocratic government, we should stand up to that government, obviously not militarily in this situation, but we should stand up and say, listen, we have ways of not dealing with you that can hopefully influence your decisions, and use those ways. But as a very practical matter, this is not a situation where I think we're going to have much influence if the Chinese government decides to use military force.
That's what I mean. But Heidi, I don't know how you, Senator, I don't know how you think we should be responding, whether we should be more strident about warning or whether it's a delicate situation. You don't want to necessarily, incite something that where you're actually being pointed at for the reason things deteriorate. What's the right? It's a fine line.
But historically, as Senator Gregg said, historically we've stood for democracy. We've stood for people's right to speak out, and we believe the world gets better when those rights are exercised across the globe. And if we stay silent, there's some complicity to that I think doesn't speak to American values and what we hope will happen in terms of the future of global order. Liberal democracy across this globe is under attack, and if we simply allow erosion at every step, and especially in a situation where people are trying to take a step forward, but the options are limited. I mean, you can condemn the actions. I don't think that you can simply say it's none of our business. I think it clearly is our business. It's the world's business. And if something is done in Hong Kong that is horrific in the vein of Tiananmen Square, I think we have to be standing for people's right to speak out. It's interesting, Joe. We're attacking China for their trade policies, right, but they also have huge human rights violations.
Right. But it factors in all this as the backdrop of when we're in a trade war, and when the president says President Xi is a wonderful man and we're great friends and he's reasonable. If things were to go south, as you said, how do we enter into a trade pact at that point with someone that would be like, what happened? Should we stop buying oil from Saudi Arabia? It's hard to take economic interests and juxtapose them with human rights interests.
Well, I think we have to be really careful with sanctions.
Thanks. All right, Judd, what?
Well, I think you have an issue of purity of purpose. I mean, the simple fact is this is a very complex world. China is 1.3 billion people. That gives them 1 billion more people than we have. They're going to be our competitor, and hopefully somebody we can work with for as far as our eyes can see, and from a domestic and international standpoint. And so there has to be a nuance to how you approach the government like that. I mean, they are an autocratic government. They did have Tiananmen Square. We have gotten past Tiananmen Square, but we certainly didn't do a whole lot to mitigate Tiananmen Square relative to pursuing human rights within China. Rational policy is required when you're dealing with a country that's 1 billion more people than you have, and they're going to influence the world politics. So I don't think there's any clear path here. I think you sort of continue to stress the fact that we're for people having the right to say what they want to say and have freedom and have liberty. But recognize that we don't influence this situation in a significant way.
Isn't that the key issue, what you just said, which is there is no clear path? If China were to intervene militarily, then we would have a clearer path. But in the interim, with China not intervening and with the protests getting more violent, isn't the right thing just to sit back? I'm not sure what the U.S. or anybody else could do at this stage other than watch this and try to figure out the multiple scenarios out there.
Well, I think we can make it clear to the Chinese that a military intervention would create a massive disruption in our relationship with China. That we should have made very clear, very distinctly, so that if they pursue that path, they know there will be a significant price to pay. I mean, obviously, we have this trade war going on with China, but there's dramatically more things that could happen which would reduce
Senator, I agree with
China's
you,
influence.
But the question I would ask then is, what do you think the options are for the Chinese to solve this?
Well, I think the options for the Chinese are to allow Hong Kong to continue to govern the way that they were agreed to be governed when they separated from England and became basically a protectorate of China. There's a clear authority that was defined that was going to be left with Hong Kong. And the Hong Kong government has basically backed down on that authority and allowed China to take people out of Hong Kong into China to be prosecuted and do a number of other things which were not consistent with that authority. And so I think the answer here is that you have the Hong Kong government say, we're going to act within the context of what was the agreement when we separated from England.
That would require the Chinese government to compromise. Heidi Heitkamp, do you think that's possible?
Well, I think that China is desperate to become the dominant economic power. You can't do that by alienating with your actions the rest of the world. And I think Europe will react. I think Central America and South America will react as they look at what a Chinese-dominated world would look like if it's going to oppress people. That's not a good look for the Chinese moving forward in their goal to become basically the dominant economic power in the world. So we have to speak with a unified voice. And I know I've said this over and over again. Alienating our allies in this very tough fight with China has not been a very successful policy for this administration. It's time for everybody to come back together and talk about what the world's going to look like when we engage with China, not just on trade, but on these issues of human rights. There are also huge human rights violations as it relates to the Muslim population in China that's really going untalked about. And so I don't think we can look at China economically without looking also at their domestic policies that are, in fact, very contrary to Western democracy and Western values.
Well, you know, I have to agree with Heidi there, and I think she's talking like a Republican used to talk, like we used to talk as a party, which is that we built alliances. That was the whole Eisenhower theory. That was the Reagan theory. It was the Bush's theory. This America First, America Only approach, which has undermined our alliances with natural allies, which are democratic governments across the world, simply isn't good in the long run and leaves you pretty much alone when you have to confront somebody like China.